By mid-1943, the campaign in New Guinea had become part of a wider Allied drive to push Japanese forces away from the approaches to Australia and to open routes toward the Philippines. In the Southwest Pacific area, General Douglas MacArthur issued directives in May 1943 that included seizing the Lae Salamaua, Finschhafen, Madang area. For Allied planners, these objectives connected ports and airfields to a coastal advance, while tightening control of the Vityaz Strait and sea lanes between mainland New Guinea and New Britain. The Australian Army became the main ground force for this phase. The capture of Lae in September 1943 depended on coordinated movement, the Australian 9th Division advancing from amphibious landings east of Lae, and the Australian 7th Division moving into the Markham Valley to block reinforcement from Madang, then approaching Lae from the northwest. Air transport into the Markham Valley and the seizure and rapid expansion of Nadzab Airfield helped sustain this operational design, but also tied success to weather, aircraft availability, and the security of supply corridors running through river valleys and mountain foothills. For Japanese commanders, the strategic problem after the losses of early 1943 and the reverses around Salamaua Lae was how to preserve combat power while delaying Allied movement toward the North Coast bases. In this sector, responsibility lay under the Imperial Japanese Army 18th Army, which maintained a defensive system anchored on key lines of communication to Madang and adjacent coastal positions. Within the Finisterre Range, a detachment commanded by Major General Masutaro Nakai organized defense around the 78th Infantry Regiment, supported by artillery and engineer elements, with forward positions designed to block movement from the Ramu Valley toward the coast. The force balance reflected both the scale of the campaign and the limits of what could be concentrated in the mountains. The Australian 7th Division in the area is commonly estimated at about 17,000 men, while Japanese forces across the broader Madang Finisterre sector are described as about 12,000 men, with additional reinforcements in the rear areas. Within that larger Japanese grouping, Australian intelligence estimates placed roughly 3,000 troops in the immediate Shaggy Ridge zone, and Japanese forward deployments drew on elements of the 2nd Battalion and parts of the 3rd Battalion of the 78th Infantry Regiment. Geography shaped what both sides thought was achievable. The Markham and Ramu valleys offered movement corridors, but the Finisterre Range imposed a narrow set of ridgelines and saddles where small forces could control access. Shaggy Ridge sat within this system as a prominent feature overlooking approaches toward Bogadjim and Madang, and it became significant not only as a tactical position, but as a hinge point in the operational link-up between inland advances and coastal pressure. The terrain also imposed non-combat costs. Movement depended on tracks, labor carrying, and limited vehicle access. Disease and exposure competed with combat as constraints on endurance. Local populations experienced these preparations through requisitioning of food, porterage demands, and displacement around contested routes. Allied forces increasingly relied on reconnaissance and patrol systems that drew on local knowledge, while Japanese units sought concealment, fortified positions, and controlled fields of fire on the approaches. By late 1943, with the Huon Peninsula fighting stabilizing and Australian formations pushing deeper into the Ramu Valley, both commands treated the Finisterre Ridgeline defenses as the next barrier that would decide whether the campaign could move from valley advance to North Coast seizure. In September 1943, after the fall of Lae, Australian commanders shifted from the coastal axis to an inland advance designed to pressure Japanese positions from the Markham and Ramu valleys into the Finisterre foothills. The 7th Division, commanded by Major General George Vasey, depended on air supply and newly developed forward airstrips to sustain infantry movement beyond roadheads, while Japanese planners aimed to delay this approach long enough to keep an organized withdrawal route toward the North Coast base areas. The first operational step was the consolidation of the Ramu Valley. Following the action at Kajapit on 19th to 20th September 1943, Brigadier Ivan Dougherty's 21st Brigade advanced toward Dumpu, a staging point from which patrols could probe the ridgelines leading to Shaggy Ridge. Fighting around Dumpu is generally dated 22nd September to 4th October 1943, and involved the 21st Brigade against Japanese forces of the 78th Infantry Regiment. Australian recorded losses for this phase include 5 dead, 8 wounded, and 119 sick. Japanese losses for Dumpu are not consistently reported in published summaries. With Dumpu occupied on October 4th, the immediate contest became positional rather than mobile. Australian units extended their screen toward the Maine and Faria river systems, while engineers and carriers kept rations, ammunition, and medical evacuation, moving along narrow tracks. Japanese forces, facing limited freedom of movement under Allied air presence, withdrew from lower ground and concentrated defenses on features that controlled observation and the few usable approaches through the foothills. By Australian accounts, this consolidation focused increasingly on Shaggy Ridge and adjacent spurs overlooking the inland route toward Bogajim and Madang. Initial clashes in the foothills demonstrated how quickly small positions could acquire operational importance. On 12th to 13th October 1943, the 227th Battalion fought at Johns Knoll Trevor's Ridge against elements of the Japanese 78th Infantry Regiment. Australian sources describe the engagement as triggered by the threat to Japanese supply movement between forward elements and the main defensive zone. Japanese units attempted to restore the line with a counterattack supported by heavy machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Reported casualties for the 2 days were 7 Australian killed and 28 wounded, while Australian reports estimated about 200 Japanese killed. Through November and early December 1943, the operational pattern became one of patrols, probing attacks, and artillery exchanges as each side tried to improve observation and deny it to the other. Australian brigade rotations and reconnaissance sought positions on the southern slopes that could support a later assault on the main ridge system. Japanese infantry and engineers expanded fieldworks on key outcrops, aiming to channel any advance into exposed climbs and narrow saddles. By early December, Australian intelligence assessed increased Japanese movement from the north coast direction toward the Finisterre defenses, while Australian commanders prepared to remove specific forward posts that had delayed movement for weeks. One such post, later known to Australian units as the Pimple, became a practical boundary between reconnaissance and deliberate assault. Plans formed in December 1943 to seize it as a necessary step toward Shaggy Ridge, using limited infantry frontage supported by mortars, artillery, and airstrikes where weather permitted. The decision marked the transition from establishing the forward base in the valleys to initiating the sequence of attacks that would define the Shaggy Ridge fighting of late 1943 and January 1944. By early January 1944, Australian operational goals in the Finisterre Range were defined by geography as much as by broader strategy. The immediate objective was the Conquirio Saddle, a junction linking Shaggy Ridge and Faria Ridge, and providing access toward the north coast axis around Bogajim and, later, Madang. Capturing this saddle would also reduce Japanese observation over the Ramu Valley route system that sustained Australian forward bases at Dumpu and surrounding staging points. The Japanese intent in the same period was to hold a defensive barrier that could delay an Australian advance without requiring a continuous front. Under Major General Masutaro Nakai's detachment, elements of the 78th Infantry Regiment were positioned to exploit the terrain's narrow approaches, relying on prepared posts on knolls and saddles, and on indirect fire from mountain guns and mortars to disrupt movement and resupply along the ridgeline. The practical aim was to trade ground for time while preserving units for a controlled withdrawal toward the north coast when pressure became unsustainable. Planning was shaped by constraints from higher headquarters. New Guinea force orders to General George Vasey emphasized containing Japanese forces through active patrolling without committing major forces, yet Vasey and his brigadiers prepared a larger effort against the key terrain feature they identified as decisive: Conquirio Saddle. This tension between formal guidance and operational judgment influenced the scale of the plan, the sequencing of attacks, and the use of limited infantry frontage backed by heavy supporting fire rather than a broader maneuver. The immediate preparation phase in late December 1943 demonstrated the method. The assault on the Pimple was conceived as a necessary foothold to shorten the subsequent approach to the main ridge. It relied on concentrated artillery and air support applied to a small objective area, followed by rapid infantry climb and consolidation. In the 2-hour preparation for that attack, Australian artillery fired 3,368 shells. The assault then secured successive knolls along the ridge, and Japanese counterattacks shifted toward shelling and harassment from supporting weapons. With the foothold established, the next operation required a plan that matched the ridgeline structure. Operation Cutthroat assigned Brigadier Frederick Chilton's 18th Brigade the main task, and designed the assault as a converging movement by 3 battalions toward Canquirio Saddle. The 2nd 9th Battalion was to advance northward along Shaggy Ridge itself. The 2nd 10th Battalion was to move on the eastern axis along Faria Ridge after forcing access via Cam Saddle, and the 2nd 12th Battalion was to attack from the east via Canning Saddle, taking Prothero the France and Prothero II before closing on the saddle. Artillery and Allied aircraft were integrated into each axis, intended to suppress fixed positions and disrupt counterattacks rather than replace close infantry action on the crest line. Logistics determined what could be sustained on those axes. Supplies were pushed as far forward as possible by vehicle to Guy's Post, reducing the porter and hand-carry distance to the ridge. But the final movement of ammunition, rations, and medical evacuation still depended on steep tracks and carrier labor in wet, cold conditions. The planning assumption was that forward units could be kept supplied on narrow margins if artillery ammunition and air sorties were available at decisive moments, and if the infantry could seize successive knolls quickly enough to prevent the Japanese from resetting defensive fires on new blocking positions. Intelligence and counterintelligence factors influenced the operational design. Australian patrols concluded that the Japanese held the vital high points in a way that limited conventional flanking movement, reinforcing the case for a 3-direction convergence on the saddle. At the same time, Australian accounts noted gaps in Japanese patrolling on some approaches, encouraging the use of steep slopes regarded as difficult routes for attack. Planning thus relied on surprise of direction, rapid climbing under cover of supporting fires, and immediate consolidation against counterattack and artillery response. Both sides entered the operation with specific estimates and risks. Australian commanders expected that Japanese strength in the immediate battle space was limited, but concentrated in bunkers and weapon pits placed to command the crest, and the Japanese artillery would be able to reach exposed parts of the ridge once Australian movement was detected. Japanese defenders, for their part, relied on the assumption that the ridge's narrow crest and steep sides restricted attackers to predictable climbs and made sustained resupply vulnerable. Operation Cutthroat was therefore planned less as a single breakthrough than as a sequence of controlled seizures of knolls and saddles, each one intended to reduce the defender's observation and fire control before the next move could be attempted. Operation Cutthroat opened with movement rather than immediate contact. On 19 January 1944, the Australian 2nd 10th and 2nd 12th Battalions began approach marches from the Ramu Valley toward the Finisterre crest lines, with supplies pushed forward by jeep as far as Guy's Post, and then carried by hand and by local carriers along steep tracks. The first deliberate engagement began early on January 20th. On the eastern axis, the 2nd 10th Battalion advanced up Sprague's Spur toward Cam's Saddle, aiming to break onto Faria Ridge and roll positions that protected the approaches to Canquirio Saddle. The attack was supported by artillery from the 2nd 4 Field Regiment and by airstrikes planned along the ridges between the Prothero Features and Shaggy Ridge. Japanese defenders, drawn from the 78th Infantry Regiment under Nakai Detachment, held prepared positions that forced the Australians into short-range assaults on narrow ground, where flanking routes were limited by cliffs and thick vegetation. The 10th was checked by concentrated resistance on and around Cam's Saddle, and the day ended with forward elements still short of their intended line. On the central axis, the 2nd 9th Battalion began its movement toward Shaggy Ridge itself, with the intention of advancing along the crest toward the Canquirio Junction. This route offered direct access but also exposed troops to observation from higher points and to indirect fire directed onto predictable ridgeline approaches. Japanese planning exploited that predictability. Small posts on knolls and saddles were positioned to delay advances, while mortars and artillery were used to disrupt regrouping and resupply on the crest. The western axis required time. The 2nd Battalion faced the most difficult approach march, crossing precipitous ground to reach the Prothero features, and it was not scheduled to attack immediately. This delay was built into the plan. The intent was to bring the 12th of February onto the Protheros, and then down toward Kankirio Saddle, from a direction the Japanese could not easily cover with continuous fire. While Australian forces treated the timing as an operational necessity, Japanese defenders used the interval to reinforce key points and to prepare counterattacks, timed for the nights following any Australian seizure of high ground. In these first engagements, territorial change was measured in tens or hundreds of meters rather than map squares. Each side's immediate objective was to control the next knoll, the next saddle, the next firing line that could dominate a track or deny observation. For Australian units, consolidation meant digging in on exposed crests, establishing mortar lines, and keeping ammunition moving forward under fire. For Japanese units, delaying actions aimed to impose a rhythm of repeated assaults and reorganizations, increasing the chance that weather, fatigue, and supply limits would slow the advance even when positions were taken. The civilian dimension remained indirect, but constant. The movement of rations, medical stores, and ammunition relied on long carry chains from valley dumps to ridge positions, using military labor and local carriers on tracks that passed near villages and garden areas. As the battle lines shifted, these routes became intermittent danger zones for anyone moving along them, and local communities faced repeated demands for labor, food, and access to trails even when the main fighting occurred above them on the ridge. By the end of the opening days, the operation had not yet achieved its decisive terrain goal, but the pattern was established. Synchronized 3-axis pressure, heavy reliance on artillery and airstrikes to suppress fixed positions, and a contest in which the defender's strongest advantage was the terrain itself. The next phase would test whether the converging plan could close gaps quickly enough to prevent the Japanese from resetting their defense on the Kankirio saddle line. The operation shifted in tempo on 21 January 1944, while the 2nd 10th Battalion renewed its effort on the eastern axis and forced access onto Faria Ridge. The 18th Brigade opened 2 steep, unexpected approaches designed to fracture the Japanese fire plan. The 2nd 12th Battalion climbed toward Prothero the fight from Canning's Saddle, and a company of the 2nd 9th Battalion climbed the eastern side of Green Sniper's Pimple, the dominant point on McCauley's Knoll and Shaggy Ridge. These moves avoided the most obvious crestline track, but they imposed immediate costs in physical strain, control, and supply. Sections arrived in small packets, with limited fields of view and limited space to deploy. Japanese defenders responded with the methods their positions were built for. Rather than relying on a single continuous line, they fought from separate posts tied together by pre-registered mortar and artillery fire. Once Australians were identified on exposed rock and narrow ledges, indirect fire became a central tool for disrupting consolidation and for punishing movement between knolls. Mountain guns and mortars, sighted to cover likely assembly areas and the few traversable spurs, were used to isolate new footholds from their rear slopes. For Japanese commanders, this was a practical attempt to turn Australian gains into temporary lodgements that could be reduced at night by counterattack or forced withdrawal. By the end of 21st January, Prothero the Firm and Green Sniper's Pimple were in Australian hands, but the tactical crisis began immediately after capture. The newly occupied features were small and sharply bounded, leaving little protected space for aid posts, ammunition stacks, or reserve groups. The same steep slopes that had produced surprise also complicated reinforcement, casualty evacuation, and resupply. Wounded men often had to be moved by hand down narrow tracks to forward medical points, while ammunition and water moved upward in limited loads. Any interruption along the carry chain translated quickly into shortages on the crest. For the Japanese, sustaining counterpressure depended on keeping indirect fire accurate and on timing short, local counterattacks. These counterattacks were shaped by the same terrain, They were typically small and aimed at specific weapon pits or newly dug positions rather than broad sweeps. The intent was not to retake long stretches of ridge at once, but to regain a knoll, destroy a section position, or force a withdrawal that would reopen observation over Australian routes in the valleys below. On 22nd January, escalation became measurable in the distance between the opposing infantry. The 2nd Battalion of the 12th Regiment pushed along the ridge to seize Prothero II, while the 2nd Battalion of the 9th Regiment pushed north to complete the capture of McCaughey's Knoll. During the fighting around Prothero, Australian troops also located a Japanese mountain gun position. In one documented incident after a rope-assisted climb, they found a 9-man gun crew dead at the site. The removal of such weapons mattered because each gun or mortar position not only inflicted casualties, but could halt resupply movement and prevent the consolidation needed for the next bound forward. By the evening of the 22nd of January, less than a kilometer separated the leading elements of the 2nd Battalion, 12th Regiment, and the 2nd Battalion, 9th Regiment. Operationally, this created both opportunity and vulnerability. If the two axes linked quickly, the Japanese would lose the ability to fire effectively into the gap and would face pressure from multiple directions. If the link-up failed, the Japanese could still concentrate fire and counterattacks against isolated positions on either side of the gap, exploiting darkness, fog, and the narrowness of the crest to probe for weak points. At the same time, wider pressures shaped Japanese choices. The American landing at Sidor on the 2nd of January 1944 threatened Japanese movement along the north coast and contributed to decisions to withdraw rather than commit to prolonged battles in exposed positions. Yet, the Nankai detachment still needed time. Every day Shaggy Ridge held, it delayed Australian movement toward Bogajim and Madang, and it complicated Allied plans to connect inland forces with coastal advances. The night of 22nd January, therefore, became a test of endurance and command under constraint. Australian units prepared for counterattacks, while trying to bring forward ammunition and evacuate wounded under intermittent fire. Japanese units prepared to strike at newly occupied knolls while maintaining artillery and mortar pressure on the ridge approaches. In this phase, the crisis was not defined by a single breakthrough, but by whether either side could keep its small positions supplied and coherent long enough to decide the fight on the next day's ridgeline. On 23 January 1944, the separate Australian thrusts along Shaggy Ridge converged into a single continuous hold on the crest. By midday, after Japanese counterattacks were repulsed, patrols of the 2 9th and 2 12th battalions linked up on the ridgeline. The tactical result was immediate. The defended gap that had allowed Japanese machine gun and artillery fire to isolate the Australian footholds was narrowed, and movement between knolls became less exposed to direct fire from the ridgefront positions. Kankirio Saddle fell soon after the link-up. For Australian commanders, this junction was not only a piece of ground, but a connector between Shaggy Ridge, Faria Ridge, and the Prothero features. Its capture reduced Japanese observation over the inland supply route in the Ramu Valley and opened a line of advance toward the north coast axis. For the Japanese detachment defending the Finisterre approaches, the loss forced a choice between a series of small local counterattacks on the saddle itself or a withdrawal to the next prepared position. That next position was Crater Hill, about 1,500 meters high and northeast of Kankirio Saddle. Japanese infantry and engineers had developed it as a fortified locality, with numerous weapon pits and covered positions. From the Japanese perspective, holding Crater Hill preserved a final observation and fire control point over the approaches and delayed Australian exploitation beyond the saddle. From the Australian perspective, a direct assault on a heavily prepared summit risked predictable losses on steep, narrow approaches where attackers could not deploy in depth. Brigadier Frederick Chilton therefore chose a method that concentrated destructive fire rather than immediate infantry assault. Australian 25-pounder guns of the 2-4 Field Regiment and supporting airstrikes were used to isolate the hill and reduce its defensive value. Between 27th and 28th January, about 2,000 artillery shells were fired into the Crater Hill position. This approach treated time and ammunition as substitutes for a frontal climb, while accepting that the defender might use the interval to withdraw under cover of terrain and weather. The peak fighting combined bombardment with close infantry actions on the surrounding ridges. Australian companies tightened the encirclement from Conquirio and adjacent spurs, clearing smaller posts that could interfere with observation or supply movement. Japanese defenders answered with mortars, machine guns, and short counterattacks aimed at disrupting Australian consolidation and reopening corridors for movement to the rear. The same terrain that had enabled defense at Shaggy Ridge now constrained both sides. Australian resupply still depended on narrow tracks and carrier loads, and Japanese reinforcement or extraction could not be conducted in large formations without exposure to air and artillery. On the 1st of February 1944, companies of the 2nd 9th and 2nd 10th Battalions occupied Crater Hill after the Japanese position was no longer held in strength. The change did not represent the end of contact across the front, but it ended the most concentrated phase of the Ridge Battle. Australian units documented extensive defensive works on the hill and along its approaches, indicating a prepared system intended for prolonged resistance rather than a brief delaying action. Casualty accounting for this peak phase reflects the asymmetry of documentation and the difficulty of the precise counts in mountainous jungle fighting. For the Australian 18th Brigade's operations between 19th January and 6th February, recorded losses were 46 killed and 147 wounded. Japanese losses in the same area were recorded largely as estimates. The 18th Brigade reported killing more than 244 Japanese, and brigade assessments suggested that of about 790 Japanese holding the captured area on 19th January, roughly two-thirds were killed or wounded by early February. These figures describe outcomes from the Australian side. Japanese unit-level totals were not consistently available in Allied reporting. The peak of the campaign also exposed the human and logistical system beneath the combat formations. Ammunition, water, rations, and medical evacuation moved through long carry chains from the valleys to the crest, involving Australian support troops and New Guinean carriers. For local communities near the routes, the battle meant repeated requisitions of labor and food, movement restrictions around tracks under shelling, and the continued risk posed by unexploded ordnance and abandoned positions, even after the main ridge objectives were secured. With Crater Hill no longer held in strength at the end of January 1944, the contest around Shaggy Ridge changed from set-piece assaults on fixed knolls to a running series of patrol contacts, ambushes, and rearguard delays. Japanese units of the Nakai detachment fell back northward toward Paipa and then toward the coastal belt, aiming to preserve organized remnants rather than defend every crest line. For Australian commanders, the immediate task became to convert a tactical victory into operational movement without exhausting infantry or breaking the supply chain that still ran through the Ramu Valley. The Australian 7th Division was ordered to limit rapid exploitation, while stores and ammunition were pushed forward beyond Conquirio. This constraint forced a practical compromise. Pressure would be maintained by patrolling and small advances, while the main effort shifted to road and track improvement, medical evacuation arrangements, and the steady extension of supply points. In late February, the 18th Brigade was relieved by the 15th Brigade, a militia formation, which inherited both the ridge positions and the problem of pursuing a withdrawing enemy through terrain where a single block track could halt movement for days. Japanese adaptation relied on time and distance rather than decisive counterattack. Rearguards used short engagements to disrupt Australian reconnaissance and to slow the movement of carriers and supply parties. Night movement and concealment reduced exposure to Allied air attack, while forward posts were positioned to force Australians into predictable approaches where machine guns and mortars could inflict casualties and then disengage. Rather than holding long lines, Japanese forces sought to create uncertainty. Brief contacts on spurs, fire on tracks, and the threat of ambush at stream crossings and saddles. Australian adaptation was equally shaped by the same terrain. Patrols became the primary instrument for finding where the Japanese had actually withdrawn and where they still intended to fight. Units expanded the use of long-range reconnaissance to identify defended localities before committing companies, while mortars and artillery were used more selectively, targeting likely rearguard positions and suspected weapon pits rather than preparing large assaults. The operational emphasis moved toward maintaining momentum with small but continuous gains, preserving manpower and preventing the Japanese from establishing a new ridge barrier that could require another costly sequence of cliffline attacks. A key element of this phase was the use of deeper patrol programs to harass retreating Japanese forces and to map the next defensive line before it solidified. The 57th 60th Infantry Battalion conducted long-range patrols north of the Shaggy Ridge area, operating in small groups with limited resupply, reporting on tracks, food gardens, and signs of rearguard movement. These patrols served both tactical and logistical functions. They tested routes that might carry the main advance and identified the villages and trail junctions that could support or resist further operations. The broader Allied system also adapted. Pressure from the coast increased as Allied forces advanced along the north coast axis from Sidor, and a landing by United States troops around the Yalau plantation area contributed to forcing Japanese withdrawals. From the Japanese perspective, these moves compressed the space available for maneuver and increased the risk that inland units could be cut off from coastal routes. From the Australian perspective, they offered a chance to turn the Shaggy Ridge success into a coordinated pursuit that linked inland and coastal advances, provided supply and communications could be kept intact. Civilian experience during this phase remained closely tied to labor and movement along the tracks, rather than to direct presence on the ridge crests. Carrier lines, requisitions, and the constant passage of patrols brought repeated demands on local communities, while shifting battle zones created new danger areas from abandoned positions, shell impacts, and unexploded ordnance. The retreating Japanese also relied on local resources where possible, competing with villages for food and moving through the same limited corridors that Australian patrols were trying to control. By March 1944, neither side treated the campaign as a single battlefront. It had become a dispersed struggle over routes, ridgelines, and timing, Japanese rearguards attempting to trade space for days, and Australian units attempting to convert intermittent contact into a stable line of advance toward the coast. The next decisions would determine whether this pursuit could be accelerated into a coastal link-up, or whether the retreat would harden again into a new defensive position, requiring another deliberate reduction. The decisive shift came in the final week of January 1944, when the fighting on Shaggy Ridge stopped being a contest for isolated knolls and became a contest for operational freedom of movement. On 23 January, the Australian 18th Brigade completed the link-up of its converging axes, closing the gap between the 2nd 9th and 2nd 12th Battalions on the ridgeline. This reduced the ability of Japanese posts to fire into the seam between Australian lodgements, and it allowed more reliable movement of ammunition, water, and stretcher teams along the crest. Within the same phase, the Conquerio saddle changed hands. Its importance lay in function rather than size. It was the junction that tied Shaggy Ridge to Faria Ridge and to the Prothero features, and it controlled the practical access routes toward the Mine Jim and Faria River systems, and the direction of Bogajim and Madang. With the saddle lost, Japanese defenders could no longer rely on observation from the northern end of the ridge to guide mortars and artillery onto the Australian approach tracks with the same consistency, especially when fog limited long-range visibility. For the Japanese Nakai detachment, the loss of Kankirio created a decision point. The ridge system had been defended as a set of strong points supported by indirect fire, not as a continuous trench line. Once the junction was taken, holding the remaining high ground required either repeated counterattacks across exposed saddles or a fallback to the next prepared position. At the same time, the wider strategic environment tightened. Allied pressure along the north coast increased after the American landing at Sidor on January 2, 1944, and Japanese commanders faced the risk that inland units could be separated from coastal withdrawal routes if they remained fixed too long in the Finisterre high ground. Australian commanders also faced a decision point, but from the opposite direction. Having secured the saddle, they had to choose between immediate infantry assault on the next major position or a method that traded time and ammunition for reduced close combat losses. The next major position was Crater Hill, a fortified height northeast of Conquirio. Its defensive value came from prepared weapon pits and its ability to dominate the approaches. A direct attack would have pushed infantry up narrow climbs under likely mortar and machine gun fire with limited room to deploy. Instead, Australian planning shifted toward firepower as the primary tool. Batteries of the 2nd 4th Field Regiment, equipped with QF 25-pounders, were pushed forward and used in concentrated shoots to isolate Crater Hill and suppress its defensive system. Airstrikes were integrated when weather and visibility allowed. The intent was to make continued occupation costly in casualties and supply expenditure for the defenders, while allowing Australian infantry to hold the ground already taken and tighten control of approach routes. Under sustained pressure, the Japanese position on Crater Hill was not held indefinitely. By February 1, 1944, Australian troops occupied the feature after the defenders withdrew in strength. This withdrawal did not mean the end of fighting in the Finisterres, but it marked a clear change in momentum. The ridge barrier that had blocked movement from the Ramu Valley was removed, and subsequent Japanese resistance increasingly took the form of rearguards and ambushes rather than attempts to restore a fixed line on the same ground. The turning point, therefore, combined tactical, operational, and strategic elements. Tactically, the link-up and seizure of the saddle reduced the effectiveness of the strongpoint system on Shaggy Ridge. Operationally, the use of concentrated artillery and air support against the next fortified height avoided a repetition of cliff-line assaults for every position. Strategically, Japanese commanders prioritized preserving units for withdrawal toward the coast, under growing pressure from multiple Allied directions. From this point, the campaign focus shifted from breaking a ridge defense to pursuing a retreat, with both sides adapting to a new phase shaped less by a single crest line and more by the control of routes, timing, and supply. By early February 1944, Australian forces held the dominant ridge features that had defined the earlier phase of the campaign: Shaggy Ridge, Conquirio Saddle, and Crater Hill. Combat did not stop, but its character changed. The immediate Australian task was consolidation, clearing remaining small posts, mapping defended tracks, and converting exposed crest positions into a supportable forward line. This included improving carry routes from the Ramu Valley and establishing firmer supply points so that patrols could operate for longer periods without returning to base. Japanese forces did not withdraw as a single mass. Elements of the Nakai Detachment and the 78th Infantry Regiment moved north in stages, using rear guards to slow pursuit and preserve order. Terrain and disease shaped the retreat as much as Allied pressure. The same steep tracks that had helped defense now imposed limits on withdrawal speed and on the movement of wounded and heavy weapons. Where artillery pieces and ammunition could not be extracted, Japanese units faced the practical choice of abandoning equipment or breaking it down for parts, while prioritizing the movement of infantry and small arms. Australian pursuit was also bounded by endurance and supply. Patrol clashes along spurs and river crossings continued through February and March, often involving small groups rather than battalion-scale attacks. The 18th Brigade was relieved, and the 15th Brigade took over the forward area, maintaining pressure but operating under instructions to avoid unnecessary losses while the broader campaign along the north coast developed. The pursuit phase therefore became measured and systematic, probing for contact, identifying rear guards, then advancing to the next track junction once resistance eased. The larger operational picture narrowed Japanese options. Allied moves along the coast and the presence of Allied forces at Sidor contributed to Japanese decisions to continue withdrawal toward the Madang area, rather than attempt to re-establish a strong ridge defense deep inland. As Japanese units fell back, they sought to maintain lines of communication toward coastal positions, but these were increasingly fragile under Allied air observation and the limited road network. For Australian commanders, the goal was not a single decisive encirclement, but steady control of ground that would allow the inland axis to connect with coastal advances and deny the Japanese a stable base from which to counterattack. Madang became the focal point of this transition. Australian planning treated it as the next major objective because of its port facilities and its role as a Japanese base area. Japanese planners, facing shrinking supply and growing pressure, made arrangements to abandon Madang rather than defend it to the last available unit. On the 24th of April, 1944, Australian troops entered Madang after Japanese forces withdrew from the area, ending this phase of operations with the seizure of a key coastal base without a major urban battle. For civilians and local communities, the aftermath was not defined by a single day of combat ending, but by the continuing effects of military movement. Carrier labor, requisitions of food, and the disruption of gardens and travel routes persisted as long as troops remained in the valleys and foothills. The withdrawal left behind abandoned weapon pits, damaged tracks, and unexploded ordnance on and below the ridges, creating hazards for people returning to gardens, hunting grounds, and village paths. The movement of large numbers of troops also increased disease risks and strained local resources, even when direct fighting was occurring further north. In military terms, the immediate consequence of the Shaggy Ridge operations was a shift in positional advantage. Australian forces gained the ability to operate beyond the Ramu Valley into the northern foothills, and ultimately to the coast at Madang, while Japanese forces preserved portions of their combat units by avoiding a prolonged defense in terrain that no longer offered a secure line. The withdrawal did not erase losses already incurred, but it reflected a practical prioritization. Delaying actions and stage retreats aimed to retain an organized force structure for later fighting elsewhere in New Guinea and the wider Pacific. The fighting for Shaggy Ridge is usually placed within the 1943-44 New Guinea campaign that linked inland valley advances to North Coast seizures. In operational terms, the capture of Shaggy Ridge, Kankirio Saddle, and Crater Hill removed a ridge barrier that had limited Australian movement from the Markham-Ramu corridor toward Bogajim and Madang. When Madang was entered on 24 April 1944, after Japanese withdrawal, the outcome reflected a broader pattern. Ridge positions were reduced, supply routes extended, and coastal bases were taken as Japanese forces shifted to staged retreats rather than fixed defenses in exposed terrain. For the Australian Army, Shaggy Ridge became a reference case for combining infantry assault with artillery and air support under conditions where terrain restricted maneuver. Planning assumptions about multi-axis convergence, the value of capturing observation points, and the importance of rapid consolidation were reinforced by the way small knolls and saddles controlled supply and movement. The campaign also highlighted limits. Even with artillery preparation and airstrikes, steep climbs and narrow crest lines kept much of the decision-making at section and platoon level, where small delays could separate units and create short-term isolation. For Japanese forces in the Finisterre sector, the battle illustrates a defensive approach shaped by scarce transport and a growing need to preserve units for later use. The Nakai detachment and elements of the 78th Infantry Regiment relied on dispersed strongpoints tied to pre-registered mortar and gunfire, intended to delay with limited manpower. When the key junctions were lost and coastal pressures increased, the decision to withdraw northward aligned with a wider Japanese operational problem in New Guinea. Sustaining forward positions became less feasible as Allied air power, limited shipping, and the expanding front reduced supply flow and evacuation capacity. The civilian and local dimension persists in accounts that treat the battle as more than troop movement on maps. Carrier labor, track access, and repeated requisitions connected valley communities to the ridge, fighting even when villages were not the battlefield itself. The aftermath included abandoned fieldworks and unexploded ordnance that affected movement on trails and access to gardens. These impacts did not end at the moment a ridge was secured. They continued as long as troops remained in the area, and as long as wartime debris remained in the landscape. Historically, Shaggy Ridge is also significant for how its record was produced. Australian documentation is relatively extensive through official histories, unit war diaries, and veteran testimony, providing detailed timelines and unit designations. Japanese figures for losses and unit dispositions are more uneven in Allied reporting, and many published Japanese casualty totals in this sector remain estimates rather than audited counts. This asymmetry shapes later interpretation. Narratives often describe Japanese losses with broader ranges, while Australian losses are recorded more precisely. The result is a historiographical caution point, where comparisons depend on the type and availability of sources rather than on a single consolidated dataset. In memory and commemoration, Shaggy Ridge holds a defined place in Australian campaign histories of New Guinea, particularly within accounts of the 7th Division and the battalions that fought along the ridgelines. Japanese remembrance tends to situate these actions within the larger withdrawal and attrition of the New Guinea theater, where many engagements are known primarily through unit histories and post-war summaries, rather than large public memorial landscapes. In Papua New Guinea, local memory often centers on wartime disruption, labor demands, and the continuing physical traces in the mountains and valleys, reflecting a perspective in which the campaign is both a historical event and a lived geography. The longer-term significance is therefore layered. Militarily, Shaggy Ridge contributed to the opening of the North Coast Corridor and the reduction of Japanese forward options in the Huon-Finisterre area. Institutionally, it influenced how Australian forces described mountain and jungle operations, emphasizing supply control, observation, and limited frontage assaults. Socially, it left a record of how modern war depended on local roots and labor systems far from national capitals. As a case study, the battle remains a reminder that in New Guinea, strategic outcomes often turned on the control of specific ridges, the endurance of supply chains, and decisions to withdraw or hold that were constrained as much by logistics and terrain as by intent.